Well, hello, New Life Church. So glad to have you joining us for the message this week. In our series right now where we're looking at commitments for building solid relationships. Last week we started looking at and considering the commitment of we will work together to build a strong bond of trust. Now these messages can be applied to a variety of different relationships, but clearly there's a connection with the marriage relationship, which is just for many people the most important relationship that they have. This past week, the thought hit me that we want to aim at something higher than simply being trusted, because our goal in our relationship should be to become thoroughly trustworthy. And the example that came to my mind had me for a while like shaking my head, rolling my eyes at my foolishness with my brothers in our younger years, and then part of me was laughing about it. You see, my parents were not able to afford to help pay for college, but one thing that they did do to help support me and my two older brothers when we progressively moved away to college was they provided us with a car to use, partially so that we could work off campus if we needed to. And it was a vintage muscle car that they gave to us. It was a 1972 two-door Ford Pinto. It could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in something like 8 minutes. Literally. And now you know why Nancy chose me over the other students with way better cars than what I had. Here's the thing. Dad gave us this car because, to a certain extent, he trusted us, but we certainly had not proven ourselves to be trustworthy. In my oldest brother's high school years, the family car was a 1967 Chevrolet Impala with a massive motor in it. And one night after work, Ken worked a shift, I think, till about midnight, and he and a bunch of buddies went out to kind of an unofficial 1/4 mile drag race strip at the edge of our town. And he got ready and he floored it, and that thing almost hit 100 miles an hour before he got to the 1/4 mile mark. And that's when he kind of shut down. He was afraid to go a whole lot faster in the pitch darkness there. So that was my older brother, Ken. My other brother, Randy, he got stopped, I think with that same car, doing donuts in the high school parking lot during a snowfall, actually with our youth leader sitting right next to him in the car during those days. And then on my behalf, one of my best friends from college swears that during our freshman year together, I turned a corner so fast that Ford Pinto that I was using during the college years, he said, we went up on 2 wheels. He thinks that's true. I don't recall it that way, but we all kind of downplay the worst memories that we've created, right? So here's the thing. Dad didn't know any of this, probably until we were well into our 20s before we started to confess. After we had long moved away from the home, after we were married, after we all had our own cars. Here is the thing. Dad trusted us. We weren't trustworthy. And there's a big difference, a huge difference. So last week, and there were so many choices I could have made as far as what are the reasons why trust gets lost. I shared 3. I probably could have shared 10, maybe 20. I probably could have done a whole sermon series on where trust gets lost. But the 3 that I chose were we lose trust, or trust gets eroded when we break promises. Trust gets eroded when we defer hope and reasonable expectations that people have of us, particularly close family members. And we erode trust when we are just totally oblivious or we just ignore what is important to the most important people in our lives. So with that as a backdrop, today we're going to turn our attention to becoming people who build and people who rebuild trust in better ways. And I want to share one important truth with you, and then I want to end with a few steps to take toward rebuilding trust that hopefully can be applied to a variety of different relationships. So the first truth, or the first principle, is simply this. Trust grows through time, and it is rarely granted automatically to us. So we need to commit to play for the long term, all right, the long game. Realize that the investment that you make to build a foundation of trust will always lead to greater stability and greater security in relationships down the road, particularly the lifelong, most important relationships that we have. So I was in the truck this week and had a bit of a distance to go, and I was listening to Christian radio. I don't get an opportunity to do that a whole lot and listen to anyone speaking when I'm just here in town and all, but I was paying attention, and the speaker was this lady who was talking about Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus teaches this. In Matthew 7, verses 24 and 25, it says, Jesus is teaching, and he says, "Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock." And the speaker, she mentioned that when storms come, and they inevitably will for all of us, the established pattern of obedient trust that we have followed in listening to the words of Jesus and putting them into practice, they will have resulted in a very solid foundation for us, for our lives, for the house, if you will, that we build on that solid foundation. And she said something that I hadn't really thought about this, I don't think, much before. She said, the time to build the foundation is before the great challenges of life come. The time to build a solid foundation is before the storms are on the horizon. In the middle of the storm is never the time to try to build on a firm foundation. So we build trust in the early years of relationships. We start doing that as a child. Our parents do that with us as we're children, all right? Those early years of relationship, one author that I was reading this week described it as a trust internship, all right? So it's the early phases of building relationship, building trust that leads to solid relationships. A trust internship, I like that word, okay, or that phrase. Now, a huge recurring challenge in relationships is that our early years, whether our early years as a child or our early years in relationship, in a dating relationship that eventually might lead to marriage, those early years are often characterized by exploiting and using. That's often characterized in sexual relationships for people who are dating. Those years are often characterized by deception. Sometimes it's passive deception, sometimes it's proactive deception. Those years can oftentimes be characterized by secrets. Look at the secrets our little kids keep from us. Look at the secrets that me and my two brothers kept from our dad about how we were misusing the cars that he allowed us to drive. And those early years are often characterized by not following through on things that we communicate to people that we are going to do. All right, promises that we make or expectations, rational expectations that people have of us. Let me return to an example that I briefly mentioned last week, and I took the time this week to dig into it just a little bit more. So early on in the story of Abraham, and actually I was a little bit surprised at how early this comes in the story of Abraham, because Abraham appears in Genesis chapter 11, and it's right at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12 when God makes his covenant with Abraham. And before the end of the chapter, God has removed Abraham from the territory where he grew up, which was quite a ways east of Israel, and he goes up and around the Sea of Galilee and comes down into the Promised Land, and that's where he realizes this is the land that God has promised to him and all. But then he continues on from that fairly quickly, and we find that he ends up down in Egypt, okay, as an alien in Egypt. And it wasn't just he and his wife Sarah that were traveling. It was actually he had like a band of an entourage, if you want to call it that was traveling with him, servant men, servant women, and all. And they were this small group of vulnerable aliens migrating to a new country. Abraham probably rationally fears for his safety. And this is what he says to Sarah as they are getting to Egypt. He says this in Genesis chapter 12, verse 11, okay? He says, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. She should be flattered, right? Listen to what comes next. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that notice not we, so that we will be treated well. He doesn't say that. Say that you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. So, springing out of just these two verses, we see actually a connection of trust on three different fronts for Abraham. The first is this horrible example of trustworthlessness, if that's such a word, trustworthlessness with his wife. All right, hey, when we get down there, I might be in danger. I'm going to put you in a more vulnerable position in order to save my own neck. Yeah, that's a real great way to build trust with his wife, all right? But one other thing that can be seen in this example is this. It shows his trustworthlessness in his relationship with God as well. All right, now, we don't know how much God has revealed to Abraham. He doesn't have the example that we have in the Bible where you could just read biblical stories going back to the time of creation and learn from all the examples of trust that we can see in God's Word. He didn't have those advantages. But the reality is, however far his relationship with God had progressed, clearly there wasn't a deep, deep layer or level of trust that he had in God. Springing out then of these horrible examples of trustworthlessness, first with his wife, also with God. This is what we see as far as his relationship with Egypt, or his relationship with Pharaoh would probably be the best way to put it. When Abraham establishes his presence in this potentially hostile foreign land, he starts his relationship with the Egyptians, with Pharaoh, with deception. Right out of the gate. It's one of the first things that would have happened. He introduces himself, and this is my sister, Sarah. Now, he justifies it in his mind because it was like a half-sister relationship, okay, or an extended family relationship and all. Pharaoh predictably hears this and takes Abraham's sister, if you will, to his palace, essentially to make Sarah his wife. And when he does that, God unleashes, we're told, serious illnesses, serious diseases, on Egypt. And then, after looking into it, Abraham's deception gets uncovered, and Pharaoh's officials kick him out of the country. Why does Pharaoh do that? Well, part of it is he wants to punish Abraham for Abraham's wrongdoing, but he also does it because Pharaoh can't imagine how he could ever trust Abraham. The very first building blocks of a relationship weren't trust building blocks, they were deception building blocks. And why should Pharaoh trust him? Imagine what Pharaoh had been thinking during this time. So why did this guy come here anyways? Life must be better here than it is from wherever he came. Or maybe he's a wanted man from where he came and he's escaping for some criminal reasons. He is coming here to take advantage of us. He's coming here to exploit and to use us. And Abraham proved that he was untrustworthy. It's an excellent example of this, of how when we deceive, or when we try to build or take a shortcut to being trusted without being trustworthy, relationships risk collapsing when the truth gets revealed. Abraham and Pharaoh, they have no established foundation of trust. So when each of them sins, and they do both sin here, Abraham lies, Pharaoh takes a married woman as his wife. When each of them sins, they have no basis on which to work through the consequence of their sins. Even Christ followers experience relationship collapses like this. And just like Pharaoh kicks Abraham out of his country, we reflexively kick people out of our lives when our relationships break down due to untrustworthiness. Here's what I've observed. When trust is only minimally established, and significant conflict arises, the implosion of relationships is almost inevitable, except for the God of miracles, who provides the means for forgiveness at deep heart levels that the world doesn't understand. They can mouth forgiveness and maybe live at surface levels of forgiveness and all, but I don't think they could ever quite mine the same depths of forgiveness that we are able to do because of how Jesus Christ has forgiven us fully for our sins and our trustworthlessness in front of him. So, with that being said, about how trust builds slowly, and there has to be a foundation of trust that's going to take time to be built. What can we do to rebuild trust, or what can we do to build trust in the first place? I've got a few different thoughts, a few different steps that can be taken. Okay, the first one is kind of paradoxical, right? And it is this: face up to your wrongs, because it builds stronger trust. Now, you might be sitting out there and saying, wait a second, you're saying the path to building up trust is going to be by indicating where I'm flawed? Yeah, exactly. Okay? Here's why. We all know deep down, you know this to be true, okay? It's a principle that I shared in one of the first messages in this series, and that is this: every relationship is simply one deeply flawed and sinful person connecting with another deeply flawed and sinful person. So, can we just start out by admitting that? Periodically, people will come to visit our church, and one of the first things I'll say with them, and I'll just say, if you can put up with an imperfect church that's characterized by an imperfect pastor, we invite you to stay here. Sometimes I even say, we invite you to bring your imperfection along with you. And people usually laugh at it and all, but I want them to know right up front, you are not going to find a perfect pastor. So let's admit that, okay? But when we've had a disagreement or a conflict, what is our default response to that? What is our standard preoccupation? You know what it is for me? Proving I'm right. And you probably do the same thing as well. And the end result for that is rarely deeper trust. It might be begrudging acknowledgement that, yes, you were right and I was wrong, but I do it through clenched teeth because I don't see the humility there that will also foster depth of trust. All right? Here's a thought that should give us all hope, particularly for those who are married, all right? Marriage doesn't require trust that your spouse will be perfect. Marriage requires trust to deal with failures, with honesty, humility, and the commitment to change. That commitment to change, that was the second commitment that we've looked at in this series of sermons on commitments toward building stronger relationships, all right? Think about it. Who wouldn't want to live in a relationship with another person who fully admits their wrongs and then seeks to repair the damage that they have caused through the steps of confession and forgiveness? Who wouldn't want to develop a stronger relationship with somebody as transparent about their flawedness? I would venture to say this: over the years, your most refreshing coworkers have probably been people comfortable saying they screwed up when they screwed up. I'd venture to say this: the favorite sibling of yours likely has a history of taking ownership of their mistakes. And it might go all the way back from when you were 7 and 9 years old. I would venture to say this: the child who gave you the least grief was probably most prone to say, I'm sorry, at a fairly young age, and to genuinely mean it, to genuinely show remorse. There's something interesting in a couple of verses, one of which you're familiar with, would be my guess, okay? So in Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus, in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27, Paul writes this: do not let the sun go down in your anger. Probably all of you have heard that and all. But the next verse says this: and do not give the devil a foothold. Now, here's my guess. If you've ever heard anybody teaching or preaching on that passage and all, usually it's the first part of those two verses that is focused on. Don't let the sun go down in your wrath, paraphrased, confess and forgive before you fall asleep. We use it in marriage counseling, and then I use it in premarital counseling as well with couples that are wanting to get married. The why of that, though, actually might be more critical. all right? Because the word and really isn't part of the text. Translators try to figure out how do you put different Greek phrases together and all. It literally says, do not let the sun go down on your anger, neither should you give a foothold to your enemy, all right? Or to the enemy, the devil. So here's Larry's paraphrase of this. Don't let the sun go down on your anger, so you don't make the devil the co-counsel for your inner lawyer, all right? And I've been speaking about that concept of the inner lawyer here for a few months, all right? Listen to a key aspect of this related to our relationships. We need to value our relationships far more than we value proving that we are right. Friends, I'm telling you, this is turning into the Achilles heel for the church, for the evangelical church in our culture today. I'm convinced it's a major contributing factor for why the world trusts Christians far less than any time during our lifetimes. It's like we have gotten earned doctorates in proving our point, and we've failed miserably at Redemptive Relationships 101. And so the world has shut us out to the most important part of our message, because so often we have tried to declare how right we are at the secondary aspects of what we believe. Honesty about what is broken is the first step to seeing trust rebuilt. Here's another step. Refuse to give up simply because the way back is hard. Refuse to give up because rebuilding trust is exponentially harder than building it the first time, all right? Yes, confession is painful, no question about it. Humility is humiliating. Trusting after you've been deceived seems like the Snoopy comic strip where Lucy pulls back the football from Charlie Brown as he's getting ready to kick it for the 1,000th time, and he gets fooled every single time. And then the person who has deceived us expects that we lean in and try to trust again. And that's difficult for us, all right? We don't like to do that. It's humiliating, and we feel like we have been exploited and abused and taken advantage of. But here's the thing. It is our enemy. It is not our God. It is our enemy who wants to make things seem so much more unattainable than they truly are, all right? So in my weekly email that I sent out this past Tuesday, I shared a verse from Daniel chapter 2. A little bit of background to the verse before I share it with you. All right, and that is this, that Daniel was one of the Jews who was taken away in exile to Babylon. And when he gets there, instead of getting kicked out of Babylon as an alien, like Abraham did for his trustworthlessness, Daniel's actually invited all the way up to the king's palace to serve the king as a very young man. And he does that because he's trustworthy. And when the king, in Daniel chapter 2, has a dream that he can't remember and he can't explain, and he asks all of his advisors to give him the interpretation of first to tell him what the dream is, and then to give him the interpretation of the dream. Well, they all say, this isn't fair. The playing field isn't level here, king. And he says, do what I say, I'm going to kill all of you. And Daniel realizes that, and so he asks for time to pray for an interpretation, saying that God is the one who can reveal and allow dreams to be interpreted. And in his thoughts, Daniel 2:22 has Daniel thinking this: God knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. And so I shared this thought in my email this week. Your darkness is not dark to God. Your difficult path back into relationship through rebuilding trust is not near as difficult in God's eyes as you think it might be. But what the enemy wants to do is convince us that the uncertain path back is so dark and it is so difficult that we fail to even make an initial effort to do it. Again, in the domain of marriages, couples who are sarcastic with each other have generally given up on rebuilding trust. Is that true for any of you? And I mean caustically sarcastic rather than sarcasm with a twinge of humor. Couples who have turned their home into a motel where two withdrawn people coexist, they too have given up on rebuilding trust. Couples who no longer share their genuine feelings have abandoned the path back to restoration of trust. Couples who stay together largely for the sake of the children, for the good of the kids, have probably given up on the hard task of rebuilding trust as well. Refuse to give up. Giving up is exactly what the enemy wants us to do. And it may seem like the easier path now. Down the road, it will be the one that provides way less dividends and benefits for us. Refusing to give up leads to a third step, and that is this: be willing to take risks again. This is kind of ironic, but I read this past week this phrase, this line. Trust helps you determine which risks are worth taking and which are not. Trust helps you determine which risks are worth taking and which are not. I once heard several years ago, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard it and I thought, okay, well, I think there might be validity to it. It said that a cat that jumps up on top of a hot stove will never jump on a hot stove again. But that the cat will probably never jump on a cold stove again either, even if there's a warm bowl of milk up on top that it could get to drink. Don't be like a stupid cat. In Paul's first missionary journey with Barnabas, he goes out with Barnabas, and they have an assistant along with them. His name was John Mark. That's shortened up to just Mark. He was the author of the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. And partway through their journey, things apparently got maybe a little bit too difficult or whatever, but Mark ends up abandoning them and returning back to Israel while Paul and Barnabas continue on their missionary journey. Sometime later, after they return from their missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas look at each other and they say, hey, let's go back to the places that we visited the first time and strengthen and encourage the believers. And they go, yeah, great idea. And Barnabas says, let's bring Mark along with us. And Barnabas was called the son of encouragement. That's what his name means, So he was an encourager. He was a guy who came along and said, hey, you might have failed us before, but come on along, give it a second try, all right? So Barnabas says, let's take Mark with us. Paul absolutely refuses to take the risk. Stupid cat. The fallout between Paul and Mark actually causes fallout between Paul and Barnabas. He's willing to jettison the most significant ministry relationship that he has because of pride, because of not wanting to be bothered by Mark, who hadn't reached a certain level of maturity necessary to continue all the way on through the first missionary journey. But years later, many, many years later, after Paul has ended up in prison, is near the end of his life, he writes a letter to another one of his assistants named Timothy. And this is what he says in 2 Timothy 4, verse 11. This is one of the last things that Paul ever wrote. He says, get Mark and bring him here with you. Paul was inviting Timothy to come to the prison where Paul was, And he says, get Mark and bring him here with you, for he is helpful to me in my ministry. Somewhere over the years, eventually, Paul chose to risk again. Mark chose to risk again. To entrust him in a close relationship with Paul, even though Paul had to have been toxic in that short stretch when Paul and Barnabas are saying, let's take Mark. Mark might have been right there, and Paul is saying, absolutely not. We are never going to have anything to do with him again. He struck out, and Barnabas is saying, no, he's only got one strike against him. So Paul risks again at some point and does ministry apparently alongside Mark. And Mark also ends up risking again. We are told that Paul ends up choosing Silas to go on that second missionary trip. Barnabas fades from the screen, but Barnabas takes Mark on whatever trip Barnabas went on as well. And then eventually, Mark ends up by Paul's side. So even though so Paul and Mark chose to risk again, they got reconciled, they rebuilt and restored trust, and their relationship grew stronger than ever. And by the end of Paul's life, Paul could see the incredible value that Mark brought to his life. Here's a principle. When it comes to restoring trust, you don't have to, in fact, you often should not restore trust all at one time. Change is more often a process than it is an event, and that process produces strength and it produces growth. It's simply unrealistic for us to take a huge risk early on after we have just been betrayed in a significant way. So start small, but start and take those steps of small risks with the intention that you'll eventually increase the size of the risks. God knows that it's hard to risk fully again. He wired us with emotions and with memories that make a gradual process the natural path forward. One more step, recognize that in the process of rebuilding trust, you will fail again. And you will be failed on. You will be failed again by somebody else. Why is that the case? Again, one of the principal truths I've been sharing. What else would you expect from one very flawed and sinful person in relationship with another very flawed and sinful person? I have, to my chagrin and to my shame and embarrassment, I have hurt and I have disappointed my wife Nancy innumerable times throughout our marriage. Things I've said, things I've done, times I have shamefully withdrawn have become at some point so embarrassing to me years afterward that I have wished that those memories could be erased, both in my mind but especially in her mind. But time and time again, she has chosen to lean in on our relationship. We have mutually chosen to lean in on our relationship, and we find ourselves more deeply committed to each other than ever before. All right? I fully expect that our levels of trust for each other will only grow deeper as time goes on. But here's what I know to be true. The future is going to hold times when I will fail my wife again. And she will disappoint me as well. But we are so strongly committed to each other that will never shake the foundations of our relationship. We took our trust internship fairly seriously early on, and it pays great dividends later in life. Final thing I want to say, and that is this. Remember Jesus. Jesus' healing grace, which is provided to us in great measure because of how much he has forgiven us. His healing grace is what you need to re-cement hearts and relationships together once again. Several years ago, I heard about, and I'm not an art guy, okay? Several years ago, I heard about a unique and really a highly treasured type of Japanese poverty that is called, I think this is close to the pronunciation, kintsugi. Kintsugi. And here's what it looks like when an ancient vase or bowl got broken, not when it was like totally shattered, but when it would get broken into maybe, let's say, 5 pieces or something like that. Some pottery artisans back hundreds of years ago learned to repair it by using a lacquer, some type of a sticky substance that actually had gold dust in it. And what made the pottery valuable and gives it a unique sense of beauty is not the fact that the gold in it is worth $2,000 an ounce right now, or whatever the case might be. No, what makes the pottery valuable and gives it this unique sense of beauty is its very brokenness. Instead of hiding the flaws, this gold-colored, the gold colors that fills in the cracks of these vessels, it draws our attention to those cracks. They are no longer something to be ashamed of. They are no longer something to avoid. They are no longer something we look at and we say, how in the world could that broken vessel be sitting on a beautiful table? It's said, if you look this up online, it is said that kintsugi pottery treats breakage and repair not as something to disguise, but as part of the history of the pottery. Its beauty is most evident in the value of how it has been repaired. God wants to do that in those relationships that seem hopelessly damaged in my life and in your life. Whether a relationship with a child, or somebody who used to be a close friend, or a relationship with a sibling, or a relationship with a spouse. All of the logic, the human logic and the human understanding that we have would convince us that damaged or broken or shattered trust is something that can never be regained. But that is a lie that Satan wants us to believe. That is not the truth that God wants to allow to seep into our hearts. The path of healing, the path of rebuilding trust back into a strong relationship, it will not be easy. But inviting Jesus to give you the strength to restore that trust has the ability to turn brokenness into beauty and pointing to Jesus in the process. Would you bow with me for a word of prayer? God, in our commitment to build a solid bond of trust, what is true and that what every one of us have experienced, God, is that various people along our life's path have been betrayed by us, have hurt us, just like we have perhaps, well, certainly, we have hurt other people. Maybe we have betrayed other people. And when that brokenness happens in the relationship, Satan wants us to wash our hands of it and walk away. Satan wants us to kick those people out of our lives just the way that Pharaoh kicked Abraham out of Egypt. And instead, God, what you want to do is you want us to lean into the dark times. You want us to lean into the difficulty of the road back toward rebuilt trust, acknowledging and knowing that our darkness is not dark to our God. And so may we be people, God, who admit our wrongdoings. May we be people who are willing to risk again. May we be people who are not quick to just throw somebody on the garbage heap of relationships, the way that so many people in our world do. But instead, God, may we be people like those Japanese artisans who see something that is broken and take something precious. And for us, the preciousness is the blood of Jesus Christ, whereby he reconciled our relationship with God the Father, and the cracks that we caused in that relationship now are beautiful because of Christ's love flowing into us and flowing out of us as well. And may we want to take that same love, that same forgiveness, and apply deep measures of confession and grace to them, God, so that relationships can be repaired, trust can get restored, and especially so that marriages can regain their footing when it has been lost. That is my prayer for me. It is my prayer for each person watching today. Would you help us toward those ends? I pray in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Thanks for joining us today. God bless you. Have a great week.